Good morning and welcome to our final day, day 4 of Building High Impact Nonprofits of Color, an open training series. Today we will dive into all things strategic planning, but first we're going to give people, I think maybe 3 more minutes to join while we tie up a few loose ends on our end. But thank you again for joining today, and we will be with you in about 3 minutes. Thank you. Okay, everyone, happy Wednesday, and thank you so much for your patience. Today, we are jumping into the final day, day 4 of our training series, Building High Impact Nonprofits of Color. You are definitely in for a treat. Today's topic, we will be diving into all things strategic planning. So my name is Olivia Harp, and I am the Program Manager for Network Building here at Prosperity Now. I am here to get you settled on the platform so that we can all have a successful collaborative learning journey. So just a few housekeeping guidelines. This webinar is being recorded and will be mailed out to registrants within a week from today. All webinar attendees are muted to ensure sound quality, or at least you're muted for now. We will have a Q&A session later on. but please don't let that stop you from engaging us. Use your questions box on the GoToWebinar control panel to share your stories, comments, react to today's polls, and just ask any questions that come to mind as we're going through today's training. And if you experience any technical difficulties at all whatsoever, please email us at gotomeeting@prosperitynow.org. This is just a more guidelines for the group discussion part. We will be using the questions box to ask any questions throughout the presentation and during the Q&A segment. And if you would like to be unmuted at that time, please raise your hand. We will go over these guidelines all over again, so no need to keep this top of mind. We really want you to just be fully engaged in the presentation. So getting the most out of today's call, I know it's getting a little chillier here on the East Coast, so please get cozy, grab your favorite warm drink and a snack, and settle in to go on this learning journey with us. Again, engage us in the questions box, leave your questions and your comments. And we want to ensure that every single learning opportunity that we offer here at Prosperity Now is useful and you can apply it to your work. So please think of ways that you can take any of this information back to the work that you love. Prosperity Now's mission is to ensure that everyone in our country has a clear path to financial stability, wealth, and prosperity. And without further ado, I am going to pass things over to Joelle Hughley to go over today's agenda and introduce the panel.
Okay, hello, welcome everybody on a lovely Wednesday afternoon. So we already went through welcome and housekeeping. I'm going to give you a background of why we're providing this training in the first place, the history of building high impact nonprofits of color. And then I will introduce our guest speaker, go into strategic models, foresight, and ecosystems to help plan your strategic roadmap. And then we'll open it up for a group discussion, Q&A, and talk through next steps and close out for the day. Sorry if you guys can hear that. It's always loud in a city. But again, my name is Joelle Hughley. I am the Senior Program Manager for our Racial Economic Justice team, our programs team, and happy to give you guys an insight into what we do with building high impact nonprofits of color. So next slide, please. So first, to give you a little background about Prosperity Now, what we do is we create, identify, test, amplify, and scale new and existing system-oriented solutions that address the root cause of inequities and racial injustice. And we do that by centering marginalized and historically marginalized communities. We partner with them as an intermediary for those who provide direct service to really influence stakeholders, and we try to lift up the work that they do in solving these system-oriented issues. We also incubate and evaluate the work that they do by creating new opportunities and solutions at local levels, because that's where we truly believe change happens, and cementing this change through amplifying and sharing the message and adopting policy change and securing this through a narrative and policy progression. So that's a little background about why we do what we do, and this really centers what this looks like for this project around building high impact nonprofits of color. So next slide, please. This is the first time that we've been able to do this project in our own backyard, but we've been doing this since 2016, 2017 among various cities, all the way from Minneapolis to Delaware and New Orleans, but all of these locations have a profile that is listed on our website. And the intent behind this is to really lift up our organizations and nonprofits that are led by leaders of color who we believe are specifically qualified and have the insight to help serve their own communities by really partnering with them to create high impact asset building services to address the national challenges and economic divides in their communities. So this is a cohort-based project program development and leadership development opportunity. And this is the first time we've had the chance to open this up to the larger community for those who are involved in a cohort. So some of the trainings that they receive in that project, we've opened it up for everyone else to attend. And this is part of that. So strategic planning is one of the trainings that they receive among the other series of webinars that we provided. So this is just the tip of the iceberg of the work that they do, but really happy to open up our doors to invite other folks to contribute. So with that, I would like to move on and introduce you to our speaker today, Alonford James, or AJ. Please come on, we're happy to have you, and I will hand it off to you.
Okay, thank you, Joelle. And thank you, Olivia, for all of this setup. I'm really excited to be able to walk you through some of this content this morning. I want to give you a little bit of a sense of what to expect, and then we will jump into the slides. We've been part of the initiative for many years, and so it's really wonderful to see you all continue this work. One of the things that we believe at Symphonic Strategies is that organizations that are focused on communities of color or that are led by leaders of color have to really be very good at understanding strategy, how to connect strategy to your thought patterns, your actions, and your planning. So today what I'm going to do is to give you some concepts based on work that we've learned for the last 20 years of our business, and hopefully give you the highlights, do the best I can to balance you between teaching and engaging through the chat and through the questions. And we'll try to do our best to pause and give you a chance to help me calibrate the pace. So if I need to slow down, we can do that. If we need to speed up, we can do that as well. So let's go ahead and bring up the first slide, Olivia. The first thing you'll see is that we have a crystal ball. And one of the things that we want you to think deeply about is that when you ever hear someone say strategic planning, we want you as a leader to be able to pause and to divide that into specific competencies and specific steps. The first step is foresight. So when organizations jump to planning without foresight, the planning ultimately is not the greatest. And in many cases, that's why strategy sits on a shelf and collects dust. That's why within a matter of years, in some cases months, the strategy is out of date. So we want to talk today about the first phase that leaders really need to master, which is the idea that your future can be influenced. That when you find yourself reacting to things around you, oftentimes it can be exhausting and it can really have a negative effect on your organization. Being in constant firefighting mode is not great for strategists. So today, let's talk about foresight and how you can apply foresight to your strategy and move down the continuum to taking that foresight and moving it into planning and action. Next slide, please. Give you very quick a little sense of who I am. I think some of you may have seen me in previous programs that we've done with you over the years, but Symphonic Strategies is based in Washington, D.C. We pride ourselves on being an organization that works with leaders at the C-suite level all the way through the organization. We work in the public and the private sector, and we focus on those practice areas you see in the screen. First, we try to understand with real rigor what's going on around our clients. We try to help them design their strategy based on that knowledge. And then we figure out how to develop your people and your culture to be able to implement your strategy. Having a great strategy that's not aligned to your talent or your partners, your people, is a recipe for disaster. We then focus on improving performance and looking at evidence-based interventions to make sure that what you are doing makes sense, counts, and getting results. And then we figure out how do you mobilize people across your entire environment, because oftentimes you can't change the ground and you can't change the conditions for the people we all care about unless you are partnering with other people who have their own strategies. And then we figure out how to change the entire system. So that's our mindset. So when you see me walking through the slides, you'll see me walking through it in a very thoughtful way that's built into the practice areas of our work. Next slide, please. Our core values, I won't spend a lot of time here, but I do think it's important for you to know what we believe, our core values for our team and for the clients we work with. We really believe that leaders need to see the impossible. Now, this is important because I want my team to not be defeatist. I want them to see things that other people refuse or can't see. And we believe that's the same thing for you as leaders. You've got to be the one person in your organization who dares to see what other people can't see as being possible. Pursue excellence, play from your soul, and move the crowd. Because if you're smart and you know where you want to go and you have a destination, but no mobilization plan, you won't change the environment for the people we care about. So those are the values that are embedded in our work. They're the values that are embedded in my life, and they're the values that you'll see embedded in this deck. Next slide, please. Just a sense of some of the clients we've worked with, and the reason we do this is because I want you to see that what you're going to hear from me is multi-sector. So yes, it works in large systems and small systems. It works in very complex organizations like the Department of Veterans Affairs, and it can work in very small nonprofit organizations where maybe you have a staff of 5. These principles work all across the board. And so I hope that you'll take what you can and don't get fixated on the example on the screen, get fixated on the principle. How can I take this principle and make it work for myself and my organization and the community we support? Next slide. All right. My background, very quickly, won't spend a whole lot, but I wanted to give you a sense. I've been doing this work since 1994. So I've been doing it at the corporate sector, at the nonprofit sector, and running my own firm for the last 20 years with a really very talented team of individuals. Our focus, as you can see from my background, is collective action, because we believe that collaboration is the only thing that's going to happen. In fact, it's the only thing that can happen to be able to solve some of our most difficult challenges. From climate change to conflict to war, there's so many issues where you can't solve it alone. You've got to be able to move other people in the same general direction and do so in ways that, in some cases, you're influencing people with their own agendas. So you'll see that woven into some of the concepts I share today. Next slide, please. What you'll see is that this is a part of a larger piece. What I tried to do is to make sure that if you're going to wake up early and join me for a 2-hour conversation, that you get a lot of content. So for those of you who are just entering strategy or just thinking about it, this is at the intermediate level. For those you've been doing strategy for a long time, I hope to be able to hit some of the things that you probably do know, but I'm going to challenge you to apply it with much more rigor, with a little bit more creativity and a little bit more soul. So I'm going to try to hit it at the intermediate level, knowing that there's a ton of content here. And for some of you, I'm going to go too fast, and for others, I'll go too slow. So please feel free to use the chat and to use the Q&A function to help me make sure that I calibrate the pace to meet your needs. Okay, next one. All right, we do have a poll, which before we jump here, I would love to just kind of know who's in the room. And I know with this format, we can't activate everyone's camera, but Joelle, can we just pause just a minute to see if we can put the poll up and get a sense of who's in the room? All right, first one, Joelle, I'll go ahead and narrate, but I'd love to know in the various categories and functional roles, which of the following apply to you?
All right, we'll give them a minute to fill it out.
All right.
Okay, looks like we got our responses. So mostly
Okay.
community engagement and direct services.
Okay, excellent. I think we have a second question. Joel, can we put up the second one?
Yeah.
Okay.
Here we go. What is your experience with strategy and planning? So we'll give folks a minute or two. And results. So, okay, it looks like we've got some folks with a little bit of experience, 1 to 2 years or less, but a
Okay,
decent amount with 3 or 4 years or more. So, pretty good.
very good. And I think we have a third one, is that right?
I think it was just those two. Oh, here we go. We do have a third. So, what is your level of engagement and strategy planning at your organization? And all right, looks like we've got quite a few senior executives, leadership. And second up is program management and direct service.
All right, very good. Well, thank you. That's actually helpful. So given the fact that it seems like we have a majority of folks who have less than 5 years, I'm going to perhaps emphasize a few additional things. So why don't we do this? Let's take a look at the first slide as an activity. And so what I've done is I've built in some simulations that we call that give you a chance to learn the material without me talking at you. The first really principle is that you'll never be intelligent unless you practice thinking. In fact, that came from one of my professors in graduate school, Cornel West. So if you all know the eccentric Cornel West, one of the things that I took away from my interactions with him is how important it is for leaders and people who want to change systems to take time to think. We all say we're too busy, but then we become a cog in a wheel. We become a pawn on the chessboard. So the first principle we talk about for strategists and strategic thinking is making space. So let's advance the slide. And here's a warm-up. I'm going to ask you to do a what if, and we're going to put the questions on the screen, and I would invite you to use the chat to respond for me. So next slide, please. Imagine looking back on your past. I want you to think about at least one specific moment or event, and it can be positive or negative, that has had a profound effect on your life. It can be one event, it can be a series of events, it can be personal, it can be professional, but just take a moment to look back on a profound moment in your life that really shaped where you are. And if you could use the chat feature to share with me, that would be great. And Joelle or Olivia, as the responses come in, if you don't mind reading them out for me, that would be great.
Yep,
All
watching
right.
the chat right now. So go ahead and add in some experiences and points of reflection.
So looking back, personal or professional, what's the moment or series of moments that has had a profound effect on where you are today? And if we have anyone who would like to unmute and share, Olivia or Joelle, I'm happy to field some feedback that way.
All right. I see we've got some questions coming in.
Okay, great.
Hang on. All right. We'll give it a couple more seconds.
Okay. And Olivia, just to know on my end, the questions are blank. So if you are seeing them, go ahead and read them out for us.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
So we have various responses. We have a few people that lost a parent, had to bury a parent. We had positive experiences as well. So people being surrounded by caring adults, people that cared about them. We had people having to uproot their lives and change things around, either because they accepted a job or lost one. But yeah, we have a lot of people talking about um, just having supportive people and also losing those same people as well.
Mm, thank you. And thank you all for sharing. Boy, I really wish I could, see folks on their faces and really engage you in an in-depth conversation. But let's do the best that we can, because when you think about moments of vulnerability and you look back and you see how your life trajectory changed because of that moment in a negative or a positive way, and sometimes you don't interpret it until later. The same thing can be said for our communities, the people in the communities, and for our organizations. So the question I want you to think about when you look back is, are you making time to be retrospective, to be introspective, to ask yourself, what if that event never occurred? Or how might our life or how might our organization be different if that event didn't occur? For many people, what we do is we persevere. We're resilient. We're fighters. We pick ourselves up through hardship and we move through times of opportunity. But we often don't take time to figure out what those universal lessons learned were that help us better understand what's coming in the future. So I want you to really think deeply about the importance of looking back. Let's do our next slide, please. Once you do this and you practice the ability to look back, then you can look forward. So for the sake of time, we won't actually do this simulation, but I want you to see what I'm trying to cultivate in you. This idea of reflecting on the future of your organization and thinking about at least one specific moment or event that could happen that would have a profoundly positive effect on everyone inside and outside of your organization. What if you received a large gift from Mackenzie Scott? What if your organization was able to fundamentally inform and shape public policy? What if you could triple the size of your staff and your resources? What if you could bring all of the different competing partners in your environment to the table to figure out how to work more collaboratively to eradicate poverty? Oftentimes, what we don't do is spend time looking back or looking forward because we're putting out fires. We're trying to keep our head above water. And yes, that is so, so important, but I want to really, really get you to think deeply about it, that great leaders go from being 90% reactive and 10% proactive to 85-15, to 80-20, to 75-25. You can gradually increase the habits to be able to pause and reflect backward and reflect forward. Those are things that you can do as a leader and as an organization to gradually move from feeling like you're just trying to keep the lights on to changing the environment by not reacting, but by influencing your future. And these are two behaviors that you can incorporate for your team, your department, and your organization. Next slide, please. Let's take an example, because oftentimes what we've found is that in the 21st century, there are some leadership principles and things that are systemic. We're all feeling these things on the screen. We're in firefighting mode. We're trying to figure out where the next dollar is going to come from. We may have staff members that we're not exactly sure who can do it. We may be finding issues with our board, and we're struggling to figure out how to work with partners. But in addition to that, we may be finding challenges with capability. We're being asked to do something and we don't have the skills on our team, or we personally aren't sure we have the capability to rise to the moment. Then you've got political cycles. We're constantly being torn back and forth by partisanship and turf wars, and in some cases, retirement. You have folks who are working in your organizations and your communities who have a wealth of knowledge and wisdom and insight. But sometimes when those folks retire, we lose that wisdom, we lose that insight, and we lose that knowledge. And of course, the other challenge that I think you all are aware of is fiscal constraints. There's never enough money. But what I'm here to tell you is that when we've worked with organizations that have plenty of money, money is never the dominant factor that influences the quality of strategy. Let me just repeat that. In so many cases, the most brilliant strategists are the people, despite these challenges, who were able to incorporate behaviors for themselves, embed them in their organizations, and actually produce fantastic results with limited financial resources. Next slide, please. Let's talk about how to do it. Now, when all these things happen inside organizations, we go to war with ourselves. And when organizations have divided loyalties, a narrowed vision, constant sense of fear, the collapse of self-restraint, conflict, tension, and this bunker mentality, which is I'm going to do just enough to get by, this becomes noise. So strategic foresight, which leads to strategic planning, is about reducing the noise. How do you focus people on the right sources of information, the right decisions, and the right actions? Choices, decisions, actions require you as a leader to sort through the noise, because there's a lot of noise that will distract us from being able to improve the conditions for the people we serve. And we're going to talk about using hindsight and foresight to sort through the noise. Next slide, please. Let's use an example. So in hindsight, you know, depends on your age, that 9/11 obviously was a significant seminal moment in American history. Hindsight is defined as having an understanding of a situation or event only after it's happened or developed. Some of the characteristics is that often it's triggered by a perceived failure or crisis. It requires the time and space for reflection and discussion, and the focus on information and details that were missed or ignored. So the example is September 11th, or the Great Recession, or even COVID-19. And unfortunately and tragically, we're having that conversation today in the world about what's happening in Israel and the Gaza Strip. In hindsight, the question is, are you asking the right questions? Are you gathering the right information? Are you sorting through the noise? And are you figuring out what it means for your future? And if we don't take time for hindsight and do it with rigor, then our strategies will be hollow. They really, really won't be great. And then when you come out with your strategic plan, unfortunately, it's a strategic plan that's not designed to move the crowd, to move the dial. Let's get an example. Olivia, next slide. What we're going to do is I'm going to play for you an example of an event that occurred in Japan that was a serious crisis. In hindsight, there were things that were missed that become things that become part of our DNA of how we think about looking to the future. This video is about 7 or 8 minutes long. It's a larger segment. And like I told you, at the intermediate level, we're now moving quickly to how you demonstrate the ability in hindsight to think strategically. Olivia, let's go ahead and cue up the video.
The Fukushima nuclear accident is often seen as a consequence of a rare natural disaster. But a tough new report from Japan concludes that the accident was man-made in more ways than one. The traditional narrative of what went wrong in Japan in early 2011 had gone like this. After withstanding a powerful 9.0 magnitude earthquake on March 11th, the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant lost all power to 3 of its 6 units when a tsunami destroyed its emergency generators and cooling pumps. With those offline and severe flood damage to structures and equipment, meltdowns soon followed and seemed unavoidable. But a new report released today says otherwise.
In this report, we have concluded that the Fukushima nuclear accident is a man-made disaster. In our process of investigating the background of the accident, we found there were organizational problems, systemic problems, and human-related problems, as well as crisis management and governance problems.
Produced by an independent parliamentary panel, the 641-page study blames government and industry collusion and a conformist Japanese culture for the crisis. It specifically goes after TEPCO, Tokyo Electric Power Company, which owns the Fukushima plant, and NISA, Japan's Nuclear and Industrial Safety Agency. There were many opportunities for taking preventive measures prior to March 11th, the report reads. The accident occurred because TEPCO did not take these measures, and NISA and the Nuclear Safety Commission went along. They either intentionally postponed putting safety measures in place or made decisions based on their organization's self-interest and not in the interest of public safety. The report also finds fault with the response from TEPCO, regulators, the government, and the Prime Minister, who visited the plant the day after the tsunami. Among other questions, the report raises this key one. Did the tsunami inevitably lead to the disaster? The report's conclusion? We have proved that it cannot be said there would have been no crisis without the tsunami. Both the findings and the report's criticism of a conformist culture suggests there could be bigger problems with some of the 50 other reactors in Japan. Only hours before the report was issued, the Ohi reactor in western Japan came back online, the first to be restarted since last year's disaster. Japan has been running without nuclear power since early May. Before the Fukushima accident, nuclear comprised about 30% of Japan's energy. Combined with this report, Ohi's resumption will likely inflame those in the anti-nuclear movement in Japan. Over the last month, there have been weekly demonstrations outside the Prime Minister's office.
For more, I'm joined by Matthew Bunn, an associate professor at Harvard University's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, where he heads the school's main research group on nuclear policy. Professor Bunn, by taking natural disaster off the table and calling this profoundly man-made, what did the commission conclude that people did wrong?
Well, fundamentally, the issue was not being well enough prepared for the kind of natural disaster that did occur. Certainly, the earthquake and the tsunami ultimately caused the meltdowns that happened. But if they had been well enough prepared, if they had had, for example, the diesel generators protected from being flooded, if they had had means of pumping water into the cores of the reactors if they lost water, if they had had a better emergency plan, these reactors might have survived.
Was there sufficient oversight to those plans? I mean, tsunamis often follow earthquakes, yet there was some surprise that the plants were destroyed by tsunamis.
Yes, unfortunately, both the company and the regulators had known years before that there was a substantial risk of large tsunamis at this site. There had been one hundreds of years ago in this general area that was of a similar size, and yet they did nothing about it. One of the fundamental issues that the report criticizes is Japan was one of the few countries in the world that had its nuclear regulator as part of an organization that was also responsible for promoting nuclear energy. So the nuclear regulator wasn't really independent, and there were constant movements of staff from the utilities to the regulator and from the regulator back to the utilities.
Does the commission suggest moving those entities further apart, busting the revolving door?
Absolutely. That's one of the fundamental recommendations that they make, and there's been an effort in Japan to set up a fully independent regulatory body. Japan has already decided to do that, but it's actually very difficult to fundamentally change the culture of an organization, whether an operating organization or a regulatory organization. And of course, the organizations that benefited from the way things were are pushing back. And so they have not yet, more than a year after the accident, managed to make this fully independent regulator a reality.
Along with the scathing criticism of that closeness between the regulators and the industry was a critique of Japanese culture overall, saying there was too much deference to authority. And while you may be able to change a safety procedure in statute, it would seem to be pretty hard to change a culture.
Well, I think the report is correct in saying that there are aspects of Japanese culture that were a problem here, but I think they may be, in a sense, hitting themselves too hard, in the sense that while there are aspects unique to Japan that probably made the collusion between the regulators and the operators worse, the reality is all over the world, and not just in the nuclear industry, but in many industries, you have often a cozy relationship developed between regulators who get much of their information, maybe their future job opportunities and so on, from the industry they're regulating and the industry itself. So figuring out how to build in a new safety culture and a new level of independence and toughness for the regulators is a hard problem, not just for Japan, but for countries all over the world. One of the things this accident tells us is that globally, our system for finding and fixing the safety problems is not as strong as it ought to be. The Japanese plants and the Japanese regulators had international reviews from the International Atomic Energy Agency, from industry bodies, and no one had raised a ruckus. No one had said, this is unacceptable the way this is being managed. You're not implementing this international standard and that international standard. So it made it clear that we really need a stronger system for bringing the worst performers up to the level of the best performers.
Before the earthquake, Japan was getting about a third of its electricity from nuclear power. Do the findings of this commission report push off the day further into the future when Japan's plants will be up and running and operational?
Well, I think it will really be up to the Japanese people to decide what the future of nuclear power in Japan is going to be. Certainly this report highlights some of the key concerns and some of the key issues that will have to be addressed to ensure that nuclear power can be managed safely in Japan in the future. But it remains very unclear and very controversial where Japan is going to go on nuclear energy. They were fairly dependent. They are an island, which makes it more difficult to import electricity from somewhere else. If they shifted toward a heavy use of natural gas, that would have implications for climate, and it's costly as well to import the liquefied natural gas they would have to use. If they could shift toward renewables, but not on the pace that would be required to replace 20 or 30% of their electricity rapidly. So my guess is some of these plants will probably get turned back on, but 10, 20 years from now, you'll probably have less reliance on nuclear energy than you have today in Japan.
Professor Matthew Bunn, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Olivia. All right. For some folks, your eyes may have just rolled up in the top of your head. You're like, what the heck does what happened in Japan relate to what we do? And what I want you to think about here is that in hindsight, there were two major events in the last 5 so years that have affected the work you do. The first was the movement for Black Lives, and the second was COVID-19. In hindsight, what are the structural systemic things that we learned as organizations that would inform our present day and future strategy? When we look back, oftentimes we were just trying to survive. We were trying to continue to move forward. And on the next slide, Olivia or Joelle, there are a couple of insights. The first is that this video, 8 minutes long, gave you a chance of understanding all of the players, forces, and themes in the environment that affected the outcome. In hindsight, we know that the Fukushima Nuclear Accident Commission, TEPCO, the Prime Minister, all of these things, including culture, played a role in the effect of what happened. But there was a conformist culture, there was a cozy relationship between regulators and industry, and there was a vulnerability to natural disasters. What I'm asking you to do is to incorporate the process of if-then statements. As a strategist, if this occurs, then we would expect to see this result. If the regulators are also incentivized to promote the industry, then we might expect to see corruption and looking the other way, or at least conflict of interest. If we have independent, autonomous sheriff departments all over the United States with no centralized authority and with, in many cases, immunity for those who take lives indiscriminately, then you're going to see a shoot first, ask questions policy second. If we have frontline employees who are hourly wage folks who are working deeply in variable pay in situations where missing a day of work can not only get you fired, but also can significantly affect your ability to keep food on the table, then you're going to have people who are at the front lines exposed to things like COVID-19 in ways that others, like myself, had the ability to work from home throughout the entire pandemic. In hindsight, there are wisdom, insights, and lessons that you as a leader need to pick up and identify as things you can look forward. And here's why. Here's the main point. Strategy is about if-then statements. And if you don't fully understand the environment you're trying to alter, you will choose the wrong intervention. You will choose things that have wonderful goals, have owners and dates and deadlines, but they're not going to change the future. How do you fully understand what's going on around you before you begin putting pen to paper to identify goals, owners, and deadlines? That's what I'm really pushing you for, is to really think deeply that in hindsight, you can identify themes, trends, and patterns that affected the outcome that we're all grappling with when it comes to eradicating poverty. Next slide, please. Now, as you go from hindsight to foresight, and again, as I warned you, we're going to move quickly because at the intermediate level, the key here is foresight and being able to use these techniques to anticipate what's happening so that you can position your organizations to be less reactive. Now, foresight, as you see in the slide here, is a comprehensive understanding of your environment and the cascading impact of various actions and decisions. If this occurs, then we might expect to see the following. The characteristics is often triggered by a need to make long-term commitments or decisions. Without foresight, you can't really make long-term decisions. It requires a deep understanding about the interactions and relationships around you. And it's a focus on a range of possible scenarios. Nobody can predict one future, but you can anticipate multiple futures. And how do you as a leader start to develop the habits and the thought patterns to be able to use hindsight and foresight to be more valuable as a contributor to your organizations? So here are the questions I want you to think about. Are you performing your job with hindsight or foresight? And I'd love for you to figure out what percentage of your day are you spent in either of these two camps. If the answer is neither, you don't have time to think, then you need to go back to my first slide. The only way you elevate the lives of people of color and everyone else around us is by making time to be thoughtful about hindsight and foresight. Second question, in what ways would you be more effective if you could demonstrate and apply foresight more often in your role? 3, what impact would you have on your team, on your department, on your organization? And let's add one, your community, if you could be using foresight more frequently. So I'm going to pause here because I threw a lot at you. I used 2 examples. And Joelle and Olivia, I'd love to see if there are any questions before I go on to the next example. And again, my Q&A box is blank, so feel free to read it out if you don't mind.
Sure, I'm watching the Q&A right now, see if we have any new questions coming in. Feel free to jump in. But right now, I don't think we have any new questions.
Okay, let's keep moving. You feel free to raise your hands as we keep going. But as I said, I know that the format here is it's me giving you information, and hopefully you'll find a time to kind of process it and pause me when you feel comfortable. Let's go to the next example. Now, Olivia, this is really important because this is an example of one individual amongst many who actually used foresight. Now, it's an old example, but it's an important one because what it does show is that there are certain people who understand how the system works, and they're able to find ways to influence their future. As you watch it, I'm not condoning the financial techniques that this gentleman used, but I want you to see that he was looking at the world differently than everybody else around him. And I'm hoping that you as a leader can aspire to have that kind of mindset. Let's cue up the video, and then let's pause on the other side and have a discussion.
He wanted to tell this story through the eyes of people who were paying attention and who knew that a financial disaster was inevitable.
But there were a handful of characters who actually had seen it coming and made a fortune off of it. And there were so few of them, and there were so many people who had been on the other side, that I thought that I kind of wondered who they were and why they got themselves into that position.
What they saw.
What they saw. Almost more how they saw.
How many people were there, do you think, in the world that understood what was going on?
Between 10 and 20 investors at most. And this is from a universe of tens of thousands of people who could have conceivably made that bet.
The first one to see that something was seriously amiss in the burgeoning subprime mortgage market was Dr. Michael Berry, a California physician with only one good eye. He lost the other one to cancer as a child and also suffers from Asperger's syndrome, a condition related to autism that often produces an aversion to social contact. Uncomfortable dealing with patients, Berry quit medicine and started a hedge fund in Cupertino, spending most of his time in a darkened office glued to his computer screen. Beginning in 2003, he turned to something that no one else in America was doing, reading and analyzing the pools of risky subprime mortgage loans that Wall Street had been buying up and bundling into highly profitable mortgage-backed securities, which they were selling to investors around the world.
I called up the prospectuses and I read the prospectuses and I looked at these pools. I could see the credit standards within these pools deteriorating just quarter to quarter.
How could you tell that?
There was essentially crappier mortgages being put into these pools, and it didn't seem investors seemed to care, and it didn't seem the ratings agencies seemed to care.
Do you think many people read these prospectuses?
I think the lawyers that put them together, to an extent, maybe.
Do you think the executives at the big Wall Street firms who were issuing these bonds had read them or understood them?
I don't think they read them, no. I think that there were probably junior analysts that were given the task of reviewing these documents. However, I think that this was a profit center. It was a profit center. It was something the organization wanted to do.
In effect, Lewis writes, Michael Berry was doing the first real analysis of the creditworthiness of the subprime borrowers and the structure of the complicated Wall Street mortgage securities, the kind of work that was supposed to have been done by bond rating agencies like Standard & Poor's and Moody's so that investors could accurately judge their risk. What you were doing sounds to me like the job that the rating agencies should have been doing.
And there's no way the ratings agencies had anywhere near the manpower to look through all that was being issued.
Yeah, but you're one guy. And you found it.
You would think that even if they just looked at a sample, maybe they would have come to a realization. But
by 2005, Michael Berry had come to the realization that the Wall Street bond market had lost its mind. It was buying up hundreds of millions of dollars in dicey loans to unqualified buyers who were, in Michael Lewis's words, one broken refrigerator away from default. Berry concluded that the subprime market would collapse in 2007.
He notices for the first time that there are pools, there are mortgage bonds supported by pools of loans, and most of the loans are what are called negative amortizing interest-only loans, which means that you, the homeowner and buyer, you borrow the money, and you not only don't have to repay your principal, you don't have to repay the interest. And if you just don't pay anything, they just add to your loan.
So you can't lose your house.
You can't lose your house, right? In theory, right? And so he figures we've reached the end of the road in the insanity of lending. They're scraping the bottom of the barrel. Now is the time to lay a bet. It's before anybody does.
Berry figured out that these mortgage-backed securities would become worthless if just a small percentage of the dicey loans went bad, and he wanted to bet against the worst of them. He decided that the best way to do it would be to get Wall Street to sell him inexpensive insurance contracts on the securities that would pay off big time if they failed. The contracts were called credit default swaps.
He conceives that they are going to invent on Wall Street credit default swaps on subprime mortgages, essentially insurance contracts on the bonds, before they even do. And he participates in the creation of this instrument. And Michael Berry is the first one in.
Berry assumed a lot of people would figure out what he was up to, but very few did. It took 2 years for the drama to play out, but the subprime mortgage market finally collapsed in 2007, just as he had predicted.
So you made a ton of money?
Made a ton of money, much more than I ever imagined, I'd ever have. We made $725 million, I think, on the funds in 2007.
Michael Berry's advantage was he wasn't part of the collective. He was just this guy in a T-shirt and shorts with a glass eyeball and Asperger's syndrome, looking at the numbers, and when nobody else really was.
How can they not look at the numbers? I mean, how can Wall Street be selling all of these, buying all of these mortgages and repackaging them and not realizing that they're not very good mortgages?
Wall Street is able to dilute itself because it's paid to dilute itself. That's one of the lessons of this story is that people see what they're incentivized to see. If you pay someone not to see the truth, they will not see the truth. And Wall Street organized itself so people were paid to see something other than the truth. And that's one of the central messages of the story. You have to be very careful with how you incentivize people, because they will respond to the incentives.
Thank you, Olivia. So a couple things with this video, and again, I welcome you to raise your hand, or you're more than welcome to use the Q&A feature. This story is not meant to endorse Dr. Michael Berry, but it's meant to really understand that as strategists, as leaders, sometimes we're incentivized by things that prevent us from having an impact. So you're submitting a grant proposal, and your organization has a method and a methodology, but you abandon it because you're chasing dollars that need to keep your organization alive. So you become guided by your funders. You bring partners to the table, and you know that perhaps you should be a little bit more assertive about making the community at the center of the decision-making process, but you don't say anything because you're so excited to be finally invited to the table. There are so many times where we as leaders and organizations are doing things today in our short-term interests that are not strategically designed to change the conditions in the future. It's human nature. I fully understand it, but what I'm really pushing you as an organization and as a leader is to be able to develop the habits, to be able to think deeply about what's about to happen. What are the trends and patterns around me that suggest we could position our organization to be even more impactful? Better yet, what could we do to, instead of fighting fires, to set the fire? If you think about the civil rights movement, they weren't just reacting, they were making the ecosystem react to them. They were choosing where in the Jim Crow South to go, which campuses to organize in, which counties in the Deep South to organize voter registration drives, which lunch counters would bring out the barbarism of the other side in ways that could televise that to the entire world. They were using foresight to change the conditions on the ground. It's in our DNA, and I'm hoping you as a leader can think deeply about using hindsight and foresight to move from being 80% reactive to just a little bit less. The goal is to be 50-50, but that may never occur because you're always going to be reacting to something that was not anticipated. But let's just carve out some portion of our careers where at the end of our career, we feel like we weren't just responding to the chessboard, we were shaping the chessboard. Now, I'm going to pause in a minute, but as I tell you my personal story, I'm hoping that'll encourage a few of you to submit some thoughts to the Q&A, to raise your hand, to engage me in a conversation. But When I came out of graduate school, my first job was at a firm where I was going around the world presenting best practices to C-suite leaders in Fortune 500 firms. Frankly, they were really Fortune 100 firms. And when I would walk in and I'm talking to the head of strategy for IBM or for Google or Yahoo or 3M or Cisco or Pepsi or Coca-Cola, those were my clients. The amount of money and energy they spent to sell us products was amazing. And I came away thinking, why aren't we spending the same amount of energy and effort to strategize about elevating human lives? So I've dedicated my life and my company's focus to bringing to you the types of techniques, mindset, and patterns of behavior that people use to sell Nikes, that get people hooked on social media. How do we take that and embed it in our organizations and build strategists who are really thinking deeply about changing the environment for the future so that we can uplift everybody? So, Joelle, I'm going to pause. I put a lot out there. I'm hoping that I can get a few folks to raise their hands and unmute and maybe engage in a conversation before I offer a few additional principles.
Yeah, we already have some questions in the chat. So this one started before the video, but I'll start with this one. What happens when foresight is ignored, seen as inconvenient, or only recognized in hindsight?
That's why mobilization matters. So as a leader, the goal is, if you understand what's about to happen, how do you create an environment where you can have early adopters? Now, I want you to think about this. You will not be able to persuade every decision maker and everybody. Your goal is the 80-20 principle. How do you get 20% of the decision makers to buy into what you see and what you think is the right direction to move your organization, then your community, and then your nation? Who are the 20% that are on the fence that you can get to jump off toward your side? So you got to pick and choose, you've got to triage, and you got to be very strategic about how you advance your arguments for the right people who become champions for you. Don't waste your time on the masses. Figure out those limited few people who can really engage you in a conversation that would allow you to use their social capital to be able to change the game for others.
All right, our next question. One thing I struggle with is how long a plan should be, especially with hindsight and foresight always in mind. Considering all the unknowns, elections, volatile banking climate, strategic planning by funders who put funding on pause as a result, we have decided to take an 18-month approach. We also know that parts of the work will take longer than that. How do you make sure a strategic plan for 18 months doesn't accidentally slide into operational plan that's given an operational plan given that it's 18 months?
Yeah, that's a great question. So what I would love for the individual who asked this question is to separate the strategy from the tactics. If your strategy is changing every 18 months or every 2 or 3 years, then you really don't understand your ecosystem. Your tactics will change, but your strategy is the destination, right? Your tactics are the actual actions you would take to reach that destination. So the first thing I would encourage people to do is, in the next 3 to 5 to 10 years, what's the destination for your organization that you believe puts you in the best position to really be able to do your work and advance your mission? Then we identify the roadmap. The roadmap is adjustable, flexible, responsive. The strategy needs to be well thought out so that it encompasses the ability to take different pathways. So when we use the metaphor of a destination and a roadmap, we're trying to embrace the practical realities of being in your shoes, which is you may adjust your roadmap every year. You may adjust what vehicles you use, or what routes you take, or what are the resources required on this leg of your journey. But if you haven't thought deeply about that long-term vision, then in some cases what happens is you look up 20 years later and you are where you are, and you're disappointed because there were decisions that you could have made in terms of implementation of your strategy that would have changed your your trajectory, and may have accelerated your ability to get to that destination. So I want you to think about strategy as a long-term vision and the tactics as your roadmap, and be prepared to be flexible to change your tactics on a yearly basis. Hope that answers the question.
All right, and we have one more question, and that is, as a mid-level leader, how can you get your executive level leaders to stop chasing the dollars and making a real difference with elevating and making a difference with the people who are serving, who are in need of the service we provide?
Yeah, that managing up is always a hard task. So I always encourage people, you've got to figure out how to ask thoughtful questions that don't, in a political way, create such discomfort that they reject the messenger. So how do you engage the people above you with thoughtful questions that create a safe space for them to engage you in deeper dialogue? In some cases, it's never going to happen because they are so egotistical and they're so fixated on thinking that their way is the best way that you're not going to win. So what you should do in that situation is observe the people above you for the behaviors that you don't want to emulate when you get into their role. So in some situations, the best you can do is to figure out what not to do in the future. That's the hard reality of sometimes knowing that the people above you are not going to take your wisdom and insight as a gift. They're going to feel threatened by it. If you can form a relationship with the people above you and you're asking good, thoughtful questions, go back to the deck that I've shared with you here, because those are the questions you can pose to then create a discussion where maybe they are open to a different way of interpreting how to allocate resources, how to staff the organization, which foundations to walk away from, and which revenue sources to pursue. How do you position your brand in a way that gives you the ability to bring more people to the table, as opposed to feeling like your brand is restrictive? If you can develop those relationships, then you're increasing the capability of your organization to be strategic. The third thing I would say, Joelle, is it's so important that these are life skills. So these are not just skills you use in the workplace, but in hindsight, in foresight, these are behaviors that I hope you can embrace to make yourself not only a happier professional, but also on the personal side, if you have children or extended families, loved ones, how do you use hindsight and foresight to shape their futures? So sometimes that we may not get success at work, but we can practice these behaviors at home. That gives you the chance to cultivate this way of thinking, to develop habits, so that when you do get to the organization that's going to embrace this way of behaving, you'll fly, you'll soar, because you've developed those habits and you're in the right space to be able to shape where the organization goes. All right, any other questions?
Nope, that's it for now, but keep popping your questions in the chat and we'll answer them in our next segment or space.
All right, so let's push forward. And Olivia, let's go to the slide. This is understanding foresight, the next one. So we've gone from these two concepts, hindsight, foresight. I've tried to really persuasively argue that you've got to make time for it. I've given you some of the questions, and I've reinforced the notion that strategy is not the same as tactics. Now, what does foresight mean? Let's go a little deeper and give you a couple of concepts that I hope you'll start to incorporate. Next slide, please. The first thing I hope you'll do as a leader, especially if most of you on this call have less than 5 years of experience with strategy, and you're probably thinking, oh my goodness, my head is exploding. Like, how do I get my head around this? Let me bring it down to two concepts that you can start to apply on a day-to-day basis. The first is that there's a difference between change and transition. So when you're thinking about writing your strategy and planning to implement your strategy, as a leader, realize that for your organization, for your community, and for yourself, change and transition are different. The reason we use the image here of the tree in two different seasons is because when you take a snapshot of a system, that snapshot is a point in time. that represents change. The process in between getting from snapshot 1 to snapshot 2 is transition. What many leaders do is we sell the change where we want to go and we neglect the transition. What I want you to think deeply about is if you have a strategic plan that's 18 months long, that's got this wonderful view of where you want to go, but you haven't thought deeply about the journey, the roadmap to get to that destination, that's where change and transition become important. To change something is to make the form, the nature, the content, etc., different from what it was, from what it would be if left alone. It's to alter it. So what I'm asking you to do as a leader is to think about examples of change. When you move to another city or another town, that's change. When you change jobs, that's change. When you have different tools or tasks of how you do your work, that constitutes change. Changes are marked by endings and beginnings. Too many strategies focus on change alone and not what we'll see on the next slide. So next slide, please. Transition is when the leaves are falling, right? That's the journey where the tree is moving through its own life cycle, its own seasons. It's the process or the period of going from one state to the other. Great leaders who understand the vision of where they want to go have to be good at getting people there. That's why we use in our company the metaphor of jazz, of music, because you might know what you want to play, but you've got to negotiate your agenda, as Wynton Marsalis says, with all the other musicians to be able to get the audience there. So knowing what you want to play and actually negotiating with other people is change and transition. Transitions can be difficult because some transitions are slow and others are fast. In the United States, there are some folks who have looked up and all of a sudden we are moving to communities, zip codes, states, even a nation where the white majority is shrinking. So for some folks, it happened overnight. For folks like me who grew up in California, where people of color have been an emerging large block for a long, long time, it's been a slow process. But if you live in the Midwest and parts of the country that were 99% white, and gradually you start to see things change for them, that's rapid. That transition process was really fast. In certain organizations, you know, there's a difference between slow and fast transitions. You may have a new executive director, a new CEO who comes in and radically overhauls things with a matter of weeks or months, which causes a huge sort of earthquake inside the organization because the transition process of going from what you used to do to what you're going to be doing was relatively a short period of time. There are some transitions that are voluntary. Everybody can opt in. There are other transitions that are forced. Those can be really difficult because if you feel like it's a forced transition, you're more likely to resist the strategy. So as a strategist, how do you think deeply about creating a process where you minimize, but you anticipate resistance? Some transitions are smooth, others are turbulent, others are easy, others are hard. It all depends on where you are in the environment. So what I want you to think about as a leader, wherever you are in your organization, is what is my senior leadership team telling me is the destination? And what's our plan to get there? How do we transition our team, our organization, our partners, and our community to reach that destination? That's foresight, that's strategic acting, that's strategic planning. You put all that together, if you haven't answered the question about how we transition to get there, 9 times out of 10, the transition process will be botched and you'll find that you didn't have the impact that you wanted to see. So things to think about. Transitions are defined by the time it takes for one thing to end and another to begin. So I would love for you to walk away from this webinar thinking about wherever you are in the organization, how can you be also thinking about change and transition? Okay, I want to give you a video because again, sometimes talking at you is not going to stick. But on this next slide, and Olivia, we're going to queue up New York City. I want to give you a video of an animation of change and transition. you're going to see the New York skyline animated over a period of time. If we pause the video at any one moment, that represents change. But if we let the video play, that represents transition. I want you to think about in your organizations, when you pause the video, what's the change we see? And if you let the video flow, what transitions are suggesting are happening? Okay, Olivia, let's do it. Okay, thanks, Olivia. If we go to the next slide, that's an example of a metaphor of the changes in our community, the transition process. I think you all know that if you go back and you look at a community that you grew up in or you're very familiar with, it doesn't look the same as it did 5 years ago, 10 years ago, in some cases 20 years ago. So this is a mindset where I would love for you to be thinking about, where are we going as an organization? And what's the roadmap or the transition process to get there? And how can I, as a leader, acquire skills to help my organization define the destination and actually manage the transition? Wherever you are, whether it's finance or fundraising or programs or direct service, you can use your skills to help the organization answer those questions. Now, what you see on this screen is an example of what you can start to be thinking about as an organization. There are some folks who are ahead of the curve and others who are behind the curve. The more you start to learn, the more you start to apply these techniques, the further you go from being behind the curve to moving to being ahead of the curve. And we use this slide to give people a chance to take a deep breath and to realize that this doesn't happen overnight. To be really good at strategy, it takes time, it takes practice, and you've got to give yourself an opportunity to learn from hindsight and gradually move toward anticipating through foresight. Next slide, please. So these are the skills. And as you think about where you are as an organization, for those of you who have just a little bit of experience with strategy, I'd love for you to take a screenshot of this particular slide, because at the end of this journey, this is what I would want you to aspire to be. Because a 21st century leader requires a person who can think holistically. So yes, maybe your job is in direct service, or it's in fundraising and development, or maybe it's in operations, but don't think about it in silos. How can you think holistically about things around you that are outside of your job description? Number two, how do you learn to thrive in complexity? Because all of the easy things have already been solved. Unfortunately, for the younger generation, the most difficult problems are left to you. And if you can't learn to thrive in the midst of complexity, you really won't be able to be helpful to an organization that's trying to figure out how to do things differently than the previous leadership or generation. Number three, how do you see across silos? So this is not just seeing across silos in your organization. So fundraising and development, seeing across silos for community relations, ability to see across silos in communications, to those in programming and direct service. So yes, we have silos in our organizations, but we also have silos in our broader ecosystem between public and private sector organizations. between organizations that are predominantly led by people of color and those who are not. Your ability to see across those silos, to understand the jargon that different groups use, different sectors use, will enhance your ability to be a more effective leader and a better strategist. Number 4, can you map out interconnected relationships? Like, do you really understand what happens to an individual who's in a service-oriented job that feels like there's occupational segregation? So all of the Black and brown folks are relegated to these kinds of jobs. What's the relationship between that and health, right? Not only sort of the traditional primary care system, but mental health and the stress of dealing with a toxic public. The challenges of balancing a system where you can't take time off or you feel like you lose your position in the organization, where you've got burnout. So how does the relationship between occupational segregation affect health? And how does health affect our earning capacity? And how does one adult household have challenges that a 2-person or a 2-adult household doesn't have? So wherever you are in the organization, being able to think about these interconnected relationships is something you can embed. The next one, understanding long-term trends. How is AI shaping what you do? If you aren't having conversations in the organization about AI, then you know you're going to be reacting, and in some cases you may find yourself ineffective very, very soon because you haven't thought about that long-term trend and its impact on you. This is just one of many examples of long-term trends that have suddenly appeared right in front of us that you need to have some space to think deeply about its impact on you, your work, your workforce, and your impact. Anticipating disruptive events. So many times as leaders, we don't actually sit down and think about what if scenarios in the future. And I would encourage you to practice that, is to be thinking about that skill of anticipating disruptive events. Don't be paralyzed, but also be creative. You know, what are the things that our organization needs to be prepared for that might position us to be able to thrive in the next 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, and beyond? Integrate disparate data sources. What that means is if you're only using one source for your news and information, you know you've got a limited view. So what are you using in terms of newspapers, podcasts? What are you watching on television? What is your organization doing in terms of which community members you talk to? Like, all of those things are so important because it really gives you the opportunity to have a variety of data sources that can challenge your thinking and help you think very, very deeply about that. The last one, leading change and managing transition. I talked a little bit about that, but there is a difference between leading change and managing the transition process. Leading is about human beings and persuading human beings to do things they wouldn't normally do on their own. If they would do it without your influence, they don't need a leader, they need a manager. Leaders persuade us to do things that we wouldn't normally do on our own, and managers make sure that we implement the process, the steps, the activities. So again, these are the leadership skills that we hope you as individuals will start to gradually adopt, and to build up your toolkit. So, going to pause here and see if there are any questions or anyone willing to come off mute and engage in a conversation.
Currently, there's no new questions in the chat, but feel free to pop them in now. And if you're interested in speaking, go ahead and raise your hand. We'll give you guys a minute.
And as you're thinking, again, I want to slow down here. I threw a lot at you. You can ask questions about things you heard earlier, but what resonates? What questions do you have? What seems hard or difficult, and what might you've already done that's working?
We are going to unmute Alistair Scott, who has a raised hand. Alistair, are you with us?
Yes, I am. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. This particular slide and this recent discussion is very interesting to me. It's a role I've played without kind of codifying it for a long time. I've been in organizations, especially government ones, where this is not, it's not taken well. People do not want to hear it. And I've been in a few other spaces, more like on the startup side, where it's good to an extent. But when you raise negatives, like warning signs, then people kind of switch off. So, and you can see the easy psychology of that, right? Because it may come across as you just kind of being a Debbie Downer. So it's really fascinating. This is like a discrete set of skills that people should cultivate. I think if you have a question, it is how do you over-index on this, right? So like, what's the kind of negative of doing this too much or not well, and hurting the organization? What does that look like?
Yeah, great question. And I want to acknowledge that it can be so frustrating when your organization doesn't support you. And in this particular case, if we can go to the next slide, I'll give you an example of the process that I want to leave you with. Because in some cases, what you might want to do is to think about, in a political sense, how can you practice these skills so that when you are in positions of leadership and you can act on them, you can be very successful. But there are environments where you're quietly understanding what's happening, but you have a limited ability to make things change. That's fully appreciated. So what I suggest is that you practice these steps here: observing, analyzing, modeling what you see. And when you can do that, you can get to forecasting. And if you can forecast what's coming, then you can prepare yourself and your organization to respond, and then you monitor. If you repeat this cycle, this gives you an opportunity to understand that you can make mistakes at any point in this journey and still recover. But it's also an opportunity for you to think deeply about, can you get to the monitor stage? Because the most, I think, reassuring and the most healthy place to be is where you have multiple people who are helping you at each of these stages, so that you as an organization don't put this responsibility on one person's shoulders. It's impossible for one person to do this by themselves. So I would encourage all of you that, if you can start to apply these steps, and you'll see some examples in a minute, and do it with one or two other people and do it on a continuous basis, that this is a good way to develop the skill set of your colleagues. The second thing I would say, it's so important, is to be so patient, because when you study social movements, you do realize that there's usually only a very few people who can do this well, and the success of the 80% hinges on the 20%. So it's a lonely, isolating experience to be a good strategist, because everybody around you doesn't have time for you. They're constantly saying, we tried that in the past. They are psychologically responding to your insights with fear. And in some cases, they feel like you are usurping their power or challenging their power. Excuse me. So I hope that those of you who want to do this realize that you will be in the minority, and that you're going to have to use psychology to figure out how to engage people in ways where they don't just reject the strategy because they're rejecting you, right? So I think it was Alistair, I think it was your name, but I love your question, because it asks you to think about sociology, psychology, human dynamics, and to do so in ways where you don't have such a big ego yourself, that you have to have it your way. In some cases, the strategist is a prophet, and many prophets are rejected. Any thoughts on that?
Well, it looks like we have a few comments and questions. So first is a comment: the leader versus manager is a wonderful, wonderful dichotomy. And thank you for sharing that difference. Someone else said this is great information. Someone else said, AJ, you've just confirmed everything I've been thinking about as I move from one position to leadership position. Oh my goodness. Love that. What resonates is the reminder to make time for reflection and planning to ensure that we are not operating in a reactive mode. Let's see, what else we have? Oh, here's a question. I need a mentor to bounce these thoughts off of. Is there space that provides these opportunities for new leaders?
Awesome. Let me answer that last question. I hope, Joelle and Chantrice, that maybe you guys in the future will continue to have forums like this. And I remember a few years ago when I taught a seminar on strategy, we were able to work with organizations on implementing these things and really trying to put them in place. So I don't want anyone to walk away frustrated with, like, how do you do this? The first thing is to go back to the slides, think about the questions, and then figure out how you can do one thing next week differently, right? You don't have to overhaul your day, but what's the 30 minutes next week that you could do differently that would allow you to gradually develop these skills and this habit? The second thing I would love to leave you with is a couple of examples of what it looks like on the other end of this. And again, this is an intermediate level workshop. So I'm moving fast and I'm giving you concepts, but I want to leave you hopeful with, if you can do this, the beauty of understanding your environment is once you understand it, you just need to refresh your knowledge. I want to repeat that this pays off, because once you understand your environment, if you're observing and analyzing and modeling and forecasting and preparing, when you get to monitor, it's so much easier. So how do we get you to monitor so that these are things that you've cultivated so it becomes second nature? It's just who you are and what you do. Hopefully it's who your organization is and what your organization does. So let's go to the next slide. And again, take a screenshot of this, and when you come back to the deck, I want to give you an opportunity to think about what we mean by these. So the first is, learn to scan your environment and make note of what you observe. This can be 15 minutes a week. So what's going on and what are you observing? And the example of Dr. Michael Burry in the financial collapse and the Great Recession is he was taking the time to scan the environment, and he was reading things that other people had access to, but they were not reading them. So what's going on around you? And if you can just devote 15 minutes to increase the number of sources and the diversity of your sources, you've already made some progress. Number two, analyze. So review the information available and identify significant trends and patterns. I gave you one example of AI, but there are a lot of other trends and patterns that are happening today inside of our communities and organizations. And I want you to be thinking deeply about what those are and how can you analyze the impact of that. Like, where are the funding streams going? What happens if we have another economic recession to the flow of finances coming out of foundations? Which foundations seem like they are moving away from issues of diversity, equity, inclusion, and access? Where are they headed? How does the leadership in those foundations affect their commitment to some of the things that we've seen in the last 5 years? Then I want you to model them, which is constructing a model that understands how the pieces of the environment work together. Forecast. I'd love for you to just, for 15 minutes each week, take a look at what's happening, look at NPR, look at the BBC, read The Economist, read your local newspaper, and of course, pay attention to national sources, and then forecast. Like, what are you seeing that's happening today that may show up tomorrow? And the more you can do that, the more you might start to realize, wow, maybe our organization can actually create something today that's really going to pay off in 2 or 3 years. And again, I've given you the example of AI, but there's so many other examples where you might be able to look at what's happening now in terms of demographic changes, impact on health, how pandemics are reshaping how public policy is made. And of course, we have hyperpartisanship. So how do you play in the sandbox with people who have radically opposing views, right? What does that mean if one individual is elected next year? Are we prepared? I think a lot of folks don't want to see that happen, but what happens if that happens? And how do we as communities and as organizations thrive? And then you can move to planning and monitoring. So I just wanted you to see that planning is step 5. So when you think about a strategic plan, if you haven't been observant, analytical, you haven't put the pieces together, and you haven't spent time forecasting, I would question how sound your plan is, right? If you've done those, then you can move to planning and monitoring. But I hope these are very practical things that you can take back to think about how to claw back 15 minutes, 30 minutes in your day to become better at this. On the next slide, you'll see some examples of how to do it. So for those of you who have the question of like, what would a much larger course on this look like? Here's some examples. So in each of these columns are things that we recommend people do. You can Google them. There's an organization in Palo Alto, California called the Institute for the Future, which does a wonderful training series on many of these things. So when it comes to observing, there's a technique called signals of transition. And a signal is basically something that gives you clues that a transition or a change is underway. What are the signals that might be happening in your organization or community that suggest a transition is about to occur? What are the tasks and tools that might be changing? So many decades ago, social media was an example of, by observing what's happening, you can see that ultimately disinformation was on the rise. So there were some folks who were really fixated on how do we get our message out? What's our narrative? But few people were worried about how to counter disinformation. That's an example where if you are observant and you can start to analyze, you can forecast that there may be challenges that would be challenges that the communities we serve, in some cases, allow them to fall prey to some really nefarious sources. I won't walk through all of these, but I want to give you a sense that in each of these categories are techniques that we can talk to you more about. And it's an opportunity for you to take your time, to pause, and to really feel like you don't have to do all of this at once. Just start with the first column, right? Just be more observant and think deeply about what it is you're observing and what that might mean for your organization. Okay. I'm going to ask you to skip ahead to the slide. Olivia, we're going to go to the slide that shows an example of the early education and early learning ecosystem. So keep going. Yep, keep going. Yep, a few more. Okay, keep going. It'll say a tale of two cities at the top, right here. So if you go back one slide, I want to give you in the time we have left an example of what we do as a company at the end of this process for our clients. We were hired by a group of funders in a Midwestern city, and they wanted to invest collectively in improving the early education and early learning ecosystem. They all had millions of dollars to invest, and their question was, how do we strategically understand our environment? And they hired us to help them do so with a racial equity lens. I'm going to give you a snapshot of some of the outcomes of that to hopefully get you excited by, if you take the time to learn these techniques and embed them in your organization, you can feel a little bit more confident that you're doing things that are really guaranteed to be a bit more thoughtful. Can't guarantee results often, but we can guarantee that it's a bit more thoughtful and intentional. Let's go to the next slide. We call this a tale of two cities, and we use the metaphor to show that on the left-hand side, and it'll be a little bit bigger on the next screen. So go ahead and hit the next screen. This is an example where on the left-hand side, after all of the work we did, we identified the assets in the prosperous communities that allow them to take advantage of early learning and early education, like the right-hand side cannot. Each scene or scenario is designed to elevate a major trend or pattern in the ecosystem that public policy and collaborative funding could tackle. So what we're doing is we're now using a visual metaphor to focus your eyes on 5 or 6 key strategic themes that we want funders to know about. These are things that we believe from our research, if you actually engage them, would be transformational. It would change the ecosystem. So next slide, please. What you see here is a snapshot. Again, because of time, I won't be able to go through each of them, but let's identify 6 things that I think show up in some of your communities. The first one, green spaces. Wealthier neighborhoods tend to have more spaces to promote safe play and physical development. That's important because safe spaces, green spaces, oftentimes from a behavioral and a health perspective, are important for children. Kinship care. Wealthier families often rely on immediate and extended family for support that on the other side of the city may not exist to the same extent. Healthcare access. Some have access to the healthcare system to support the social, cognitive, and behavioral development of children and youth. Think counselors, think therapists, think psychologists. In many cases, those are not accessible to people on the other side of the city. On the right-hand side, unpredictable routines. An unpredictable change to a work schedule can wreak havoc on a family's routine and their ability to maintain employment. Financial insecurity. Low-wage workers in the field of education and early learning tend to be very low paid, and so they're financially vulnerable and more stressed. If our children are our greatest asset, yet the adults who are caring for them in poorer neighborhoods are stressed, burned out, and worried about their own financial security, why aren't we investing in those adults? Right? Not only why aren't we paying teachers more, why aren't we paying the folks who care for kids who are not in school yet more? So again, huge challenge here, but financial insecurity of the adults means you have a revolving door. You have people who can't afford to be in this ecosystem, so you never get folks who've got 20 years of experience because they've never really had the ability for 20 years to do what they love because it's not financially feasible. Last example, affordability. So finding affordable, high quality slots for childcare can be daunting. Many of you know there's a difference between a childcare center where the adult says we're babysitting and a center where they're actually developing the child while you are at work. Babysitting is a mindset, a technique, and a methodology that is not at the same level of people sometimes on wealthier parts of the community who get all kinds of things from Montessori experiences all the way down the continuum. So I'm going to pause here because it's 11:45, but I wanted you to see an example where we took the analysis, the observations, the modeling, the forecasting to then focus on 6 major themes that a group of people could come together to figure out what strategically are we going to do. Okay, Joelle, let's pause here. I think we've got 15 minutes. Would love to stop, see if we can engage folks in Q&A before we bring it to a close.
Sure. So looking at the chat, we have quite a few questions that came in a little bit earlier. So we'll start with Cynthia. How do we keep our organization not politicized and having DC with almost democratic run? How can we embrace others and not divide?
I think you said DC, right? Is that right?
Yep.
Okay, I'm in the DC area, so I understand the question. First thing I would suggest that you think about is in our work, we try to make sure that all people show up in the ecosystem, because we really believe that if it seems like it's a competition between one community and another for scarce resources, the group with power is going to win. So your job as a strategist is to think broadly about these trends, and then how do you present it as a win-win? So if we move the dial on this policy, or we shift resources over here, what are the benefits to the entire community? And that's an art form as a strategist that you've got to use, because that's leadership, right? A manager tells you what to do. A leader persuades you that it's in your interest to do it. So it's hard because in every environment, you may have groups who have their own agendas, who have their own bias about what you're promoting. And in some cases, you've got to find ways to be open, to engage them, because there's a hidden agenda and there's an open agenda. And what I always say to leaders is you got to know the hidden agenda, because if you don't understand the hidden agenda, you're going to get outplayed, right? So how do you have a conversation with people who have different perspectives where they can speak truthfully about what they want to see happen, but also you can subtly get to know what quietly are they trying to assert, because you got to figure out how to tackle that in order to get them to not resist, to not reject. And in examples like DC and other areas, oftentimes you find that we are preaching to the choir. Too many people have already drank the Kool-Aid. So we get, in some cases, comfortable. But then when you move to the Deep South or the Midwest, you find that the people who hold power, who have millions of dollars at their disposal, are folks that you've got to have an engagement with at a different level. Hope that answers the question.
All right. So the next question we have is, what is the best way to measure each step in the practicing of foresight and hindsight?
Well, I think the best and the easiest way is, how much time did you commit to it? I would just say start slow. And, you know, if you think about our own physical health, we may want to lower our blood pressure or our cholesterol levels. I'm speaking personally here. I can't get too fixated on the numbers because every 6 months I go in and see the results, but I can focus on every day that I make good choices on what I eat, exercise, my mental health. So I would encourage you to focus on habits. You know, what are the habits you as a leader are developing on a daily basis? And then every 6 months pause to see how you can refine that. You know, what choices and decisions did you make that created bad habits? And those bad habits is you're constantly going from fire to fire. Every email is equally important, and you all know that's not the case. How do you ignore some emails and some people so that you can carve out time to be thoughtful? That comes with political repercussions because everybody thinks that they're important. So how do you manage relationships so that you're not creating enemies, but you're also creating time for yourself to think and plan? And finally, the most important thing here is, I think gradually there are ways to manage impact. We define impact as altering the trajectory of a trend or pattern. What's the trend or pattern that through good strategy you can alter? There are 7 ways to alter it. I don't have time today to give you those 7, but I'm happy to send that to Joelle and something you guys can think about. But how are you altering the trajectory of a trend or pattern? Your organization should be thinking deeply about that.
All right, and we have one last question. Was the tale of the 2-city intervention successful?
It was not, and let me tell you why. The largest foundation in that city decided that politically it was in their interest to go in a different direction. And having done symphonic now for 20 years, and I think about the experience I had before that, the hardest thing for me to do was to let go of the fact that I can give my best, but I can't guarantee that people will act the same way I would want them to act. And if you think about social movements and you think about the work you all do, you have to be comfortable with the fact that if you gave your best analysis and your best effort and you tried to persuade people, sometimes you have to wait out the decision makers and bring in a new group of people or generations who can pick up and take the baton and take it to the next level. So if you talk to any folks from the civil rights generation, you know, in some cases they laid the groundwork for what the BLM movement did, but it's going to be so important for Gen Z to be able to take the baton and run to the next level without being discouraged. So this is an example where somebody can pick up our results, our product, and it would still be relevant. Okay. Any other questions?
We do have a raised hand in the audience. So as we're heading towards the end of this learning opportunity, I'm going to unmute Barb Davis so that we can hear some of your voices. So Barb, you are unmuted so that we can hear from you.
Good morning. Are you able to hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Thank you for this presentation. This has been very insightful and helpful, along with all the resources. So I can't wait to dive in on some of the suggestions that you gave. I had my hand raised because I am basically a one-woman team. So I'm a program manager and just trying to wear 6 different hats. So even though we don't have the staffing to do everything I would like, even though we have a strategic plan in place, it's kind of challenging and difficult until we can rehire a ED and an assistant. So I wanted to know, do you have any suggestions or recommendations on how I can move forward until we can fill those vacancies?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, God bless you for being the only one. No. Here's what I say to folks who are kind of by themselves. The first thing I would encourage you to do is in your work, identify what we call a leading indicator and a lagging indicator. So in the program sense, what would be the things you would see that would show up in your work or in the behaviors of the folks you're serving that would be a leading indicator to suggest something better is coming? Because that's good strategy. Because if you can get more leading indicators, you can then change things downstream, but you may need the results to make the argument for more resources. And sometimes you can't get more resources unless people can really understand how they're connected. So Barb, I'll give you an example. I talked a little bit about, blood pressure and cholesterol levels. Those are lagging indicators. So when you go into the doctor's office or you think about communities of color, there's a lot of stress that we carry on our shoulders. If we want to change those lagging indicators, what are the leading indicators we would want to see? And I mentioned to you diet and exercise, but also mental health. So I would encourage you to not bite off too much, but to think about from a programmatic perspective in the next 12 to 18 months, what are the leading indicators that I think we can influence that would suggest that my strategy would get greater traction and allow people to engage me at a different level so I can make the ask for more resources, right? I would start there.
Okay.
Yep. Barb, how's that sound? Does that sound helpful?
It does.
Yep. Good. Okay. Any other questions or comments? All right, Joelle, I know you kind of have some concluding remarks, so I'm happy to kind of go off stage and let you bring it to a close.
All right. Well, thank you, AJ. It's always been a pleasure to have you here. So thank you so much for your time today. All right. Well, thank you all for coming. Next steps, few things. If you haven't already, please join our advocacy center. Stay up to date on all the work, the amazing work that we're doing here at PN. We'll be sending out a follow-up survey. Please make sure you complete that. We'd love to hear your feedback on how some of these webinars are going. And of course, sign up for one of our networks. There's always an opportunity to stay in the know about the issues that concern you and your organizations and the things that you care about. And as always, we're open to suggestions for future call topics and whatnot. So with that, next slide is just a few other opportunities, example of our networks and our campaigns that we're working on around home ownership, consumer protections, extremely important, financial security, and turn it right side up. So looking at tax incentives and tax revisions. So there's so much work going on at PN. There's always a way for you guys to engage. So with that, you guys have been a wonderful, wonderful audience. To answer a couple questions in the chat, there are no handouts for this, but we will send out this recording so you guys can always see this at a later time. But we really appreciate you joining us this afternoon or this morning, almost afternoon. But thank you so much, and everyone have a good rest of your day today.